strengthened because we celebrate the conclusion of the third book. And that's what we're going to do this Shabbat, even if we're not in synagogue. We're not going to be in the synagogue, but the energy is in the air of concluding of the third book. Okay, so what is the theme of these two parshiot, the two portions? So the first is interesting. It's a lot about the economy in biblical Israel. Fascinating laws with great implications for the economy at large. And in short, it's the laws of the sabbatical and the jubilee, the yovel. And in short, what happens is that the seventh year, every seventh year, everybody must let the land rest. You're not allowed to work the land, and the produce that's in the land on its own. Let's say if you have a orchard, you're not working the land, but the land is still giving produce. That produce belongs to everybody. It does not belong exclusively to the owner. While you own the land, you cannot exclude anybody from coming and taking the produce. You cannot take produce to your own storehouse. You could just take as much as everybody else. You can take as much as you need to eat, but you can't store it. And that's the sabbatical year, the seventh year, Shvi'it, the seventh year. After that's one concept. Then it gets even more interesting with even greater ramifications, is that there's the concept of Yovel, the Jubilee. Jubilee is every 50th year, you proclaim freedom in the land. What does freedom mean? Anybody who's a servant or slave goes free. And more interestingly, all land that was sold goes back to its original owner. So so in biblical Israel, you can't really sell land. You could sell land up to the Jubilee. So if you're selling year one, you have 49 years. But if you're selling year 40, then there's only 9 years left. So you can have a long-term lease, but you can't really have a sale. And the ramifications are tremendous, because really what happens is that ultimately every person in Israel, it has that financial security, that safety net, that even if they are poor and they're forced to sell their field, eventually the real estate will come back to either them or their family. So that sort of anchors them in the land. And that's the big idea of the sabbatical and the jubilee. It affected the thinkers of the founding fathers, and even before them. The verses from this week's parsha the verse from this week's parsha is the verse inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, where it says, "Proclaim freedom throughout the land." That comes from this week's parsha. So that's the first portion, is a lot about the economy. There's more sub-concepts, and that is there are more regulation for sale of fields even before the 50th year. And in short, if I sell my land, my ancestral land, because I'm poor, I have the right to buy it back when I once again regain my financial footing. And there's a process of how that works, and how do you determine the value of the field when I want to buy it back. So maybe we'll get to that. And then there are other laws about the economy and about homes, that have sale of homes. Again, a lot of them are interesting, not just because of the actual law, but because of what are the economic policies that these laws are trying to uphold, and what are the values that they're trying to put forth. So that's a discussion for itself. That's the portion of Behar. We'll get back to this. We go to the next portion, Bechukosai. Bechukosai literally means my decrees. And the final verse, the final section in the final portion in the book of in the book of Leviticus, is what we call the blessings and the rebuke. And the blessings are, if we follow the Torah, there will be blessings, and the Torah lists the blessings. And if we don't, the Torah lists the rebuke, the exile, and the suffering that will follow. And that's sort of the end. And then there's a final section about giving charity and donating, pledging to God and pledging to the temple. And there's some laws about that, which are also interesting. So there is a lot to talk about. If I said anything that sounded interesting to you, and you want to text and you want to say you want me to focus on that, go ahead. Otherwise, you'll have to hear what I want to talk about, which may or may not be the same thing that you want to talk about. So don't be shy. Either raise your hand or send me a text. and we could start the journey. Okay, the good news is we have a few minutes. The bad news is sooner or later we're going to run out of time. Okay, here we go. Behar. So let's talk about the opening statement. The opening statement is, I'm looking at Leviticus chapter, I first have to find it. I'm looking at Leviticus. If you have the book, if you don't have the book, that's okay. You don't need the book. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 1. So let's think about the opening. The opening says, Hashem speaks to Moshe at Mount Sinai saying, and what does he tell him on Mount Sinai? Speak to the Jewish people. When you enter the land that I give you, the land will rest, a Shabbat for Hashem. And then it continues. 6 years you should work the land. You should Tizra. 6 years you should plant. 6 years you could prune the vineyard and gather the grain. On the 7th year, it will be Shabbat to Hashem. Okay. So the first thing we want to talk about, or I should say I want to talk about, if you want to talk about something else, let me know. The first thing I want to talk about is two interesting concepts here that are interrelated. First of all, there's a why are we mentioning Sinai? There's a famous Medrash, and Rashi quotes it. And Ma inyan Shemitah eitz al har Sinai. What does the sabbatical have to do with Sinai? Meaning to say, all the mitzvot of the Torah were given at Sinai. None of them does the Torah say, Hashem spoke to Moshe at Mount Sinai saying. That introduction, mentioning Sinai, is unusual. Unusual to the extent that the Medrash asks the question, what does Shemitah, what does the sabbatical have to do with Mount Sinai? Okay, now this phrase, what does sabbatical have to do with Mount Sinai? It becomes, in modern Hebrew, it's actually very funny. In modern Hebrew, if you want to say, what does one thing have to do with the other? I don't know if this is a saying. When we were kids, we would say, what does this have to do with the price of cheese in China? I don't know if that's a thing, but that's what we used to say. We need to say, what does one thing got to do with the other? So in modern Hebrew, when you say something out of context, someone's going to ask you, what does Shemitah have to do with Sinai? Now, if they're not religious, they won't know what the context of this saying comes from. Where does this come from? What does that mean? But it's one of those sayings that trickled in to modern Hebrew from the Torah. So it's actually funny when you read it in spoken language in Israel from people who don't necessarily know the origin of the statement. So that's just entertainment. But in any case, what does Shemitah have to do with Sinai? How come specifically at Sinai? Specifically at the sabbatical year, does the Torah mention Mount Sinai? In fact, the name of this parsha is Behar, the mountain, because that's the opening phrase. Hashem spoke to Moshe at Mount Sinai. So that's question number one. A Jew never answers a question. A Jew always answers the question by putting forth another question. Try it. If you ask a Jew, you ask him a question. Instead of answering, he'll ask you another question. So I'm going to do the same. We'll have a second question. What's the second question? The second question is the chronological order of these verses. It's very strange. Hashem tells Moshe, when you enter the land will rest a sabbatical. That's not correct. That's inaccurate. Why is that inaccurate? Because you don't make a sabbatical as soon as you enter the land. What happens first? First, you work the land 6 years, and only then do you rest. Right? You don't do rest year one. First, you do 6 years of work and then rest. So the question is, why does the Torah say in verse 2, the Torah says, as soon as you enter the land, there'll be Shabbat for God, a full year of sabbatical. Then it says, verse 3, 6 years you'll work. And verse 4 says, oh, the 7th year you'll rest. So why are we starting with the rest if the rest doesn't happen until verse 7? That's the question. Something is strange, right? It says the first thing it says you'll rest, and then it says, oh, you work for 6 years and then rest. In reality, we don't rest right away. In reality, we first work 6 years and then we rest. So that's the question. So one way to think about it is the Jew going into Sinai, going into Israel, is having some sort of identity crisis. Why? Because for the first time, the Jewish people are going into agriculture. Up to that point, they were either in the business of raising cattle, they were shepherds like the patriarchs, or they were slaves in Egypt, or they were wandering through the desert, but they were never involved in agriculture. Now, the problem with agriculture is that it's all consuming and it pulls you into the land. It's no surprise. Yeah, we can talk about this all day, but agriculture takes a lot of effort. We talk about the fact that, slavery develops, when agriculture develops, because you need all that manpower. The patriarchs tried to raise cattle. Raising cattle is much less labor intensive, but agriculture is sort of all consuming. I know we planted a few bushes 2 days ago in front of the house, and yesterday I forgot that I didn't water it. So at 10 o'clock at night, I go outside to water bushes. Now that's crazy. Who would go outside 10 o'clock at night to water bushes? But that's the nature of agriculture. That's what it's going to do to you. And that's just a few bushes. If you have to raise your food, that's sort of a full-time job. It's all consuming. So now the question becomes, so we shifted. We were people that were more spiritually oriented. You know, the profession of raising cattle is very good. It leaves you a lot of time. Basically, all you do is you sit on the mountain and you watch the sheep graze. It's not very hard. I remember traveling through Judea in Israel, and you see an Arab kid, maybe 6 years old, herding maybe 300 sheep. Not hard. It's not labor intensive. You have a lot of time for yourself. You can write poetry like King David did. And it's wonderful. It's a good life. But once you enter Israel and you start investing in agriculture, it's all consuming. And now the danger is a person may forget and realize and identify themselves as a person. What's my calling? My calling is to raise vegetables and fruit from the ground. In other words, I am now a farmer. So what the Torah is trying to do is trying to tell you, you have to understand there's a difference between who you are, what's your essence, and what you do. And the first thing says, when you enter the land of Israel, what's the definition of Israel? Israel is a place where there'll be a sabbatical. I know you're going to work for 6 years, but that's not the goal. The goal is that on the 7th year, you have time for God. That's the goal. So the reason why we start with the rest is not because that's the order of things, that the first year we rest. No, the verse 2 says the first thing you do when you enter the land of Israel is rest. It means to tell you that that's the purpose of the whole enterprise. Why am I entering Israel? Why am I raising vegetables? Why am I raising grain? So that I will be able to rest on the 7th year. Then the verse tells you, how do you do it? 6 years, you work, the 7th day you rest. But what the verse is really trying to do is tell you, how do you self-define? Am I someone who raises vegetables, or am I someone who dedicates time for God? And the Torah is saying unequivocally, you're a person who dedicates time to God. Yeah, you also have to work for 6 years, but that's not the goal. The 6 years is leading up to the 7th year, which also explains the other question that we asked. What does Shemitah, what does the sabbatical year have anything to do with Sinai? And the answer is both. The sabbatical year, the purpose of the sabbatical year is to be able to dedicate time to God. So what the Torah is telling you, Hashem says, speak to the people. Hashem speaks to Moshe at Mount Sinai. Why are you evoking Sinai? We're far away from Sinai. By the time we go into Israel, and by the time we settle the land, we conquer the land, and by the time we divide the land, which is when the sabbatical kicks in, we are at least 54 years after Sinai. So why you vote 40 years in the desert, 7 years to conquer the land, 7 years to divide the land, and then you start the counting of the Shemitah. So why are you evoking Sinai? So basically, what the Hasidic commentators say is God is telling us, who are you? You're not a farmer. You're someone who stands at Sinai. You're someone who connects to God. You're someone who studies Torah. Okay, you also have to work. Okay, but that's not what defines you. That's something that you do in order to sustain your true identity. What's your true identity? Your true identity is someone who stands at Sinai in tune with the words of God. Your true identity is someone who rests and allows the earth to rest on the 7th year. So that is just to set the stage. What am I? And I'm not a farmer in Israel, even though my name is Feldman, which is German for a man of the field. So I guess I tune up when it comes to this parsha, but I'm not a field. I'm not a farmer. I don't garden too much. I should garden more, but it's nice. It's comfortable to garden. But in any case, everybody is in the same position, because everybody in their life has two types of moments. You have moments where you're dedicated to holiness, spirituality, things that are transcendent. And then you have moments that are dedicated to the mundane. I have to eat, I have to drink, I have to sleep. I have to run errands. I have to catch the train. Well, in the good days when they still had trains, I have to make it to the cleaners. In the good days when I still used to wear a pressed suit, there were all kinds of things you had to do. Now, what happens is that I look at my day and I say 95% of my day on a good day, maybe 99% of my day, I'm devoting to things that are mundane or physical. that I'm not spiritually oriented. So I look at myself and either I get depressed and I say, I wish I had more time for what I really want to do. Or what I say is, okay, so let's make peace. I'm going to define myself. What am I? I'm a person whose job it is to balance the bank. I'm the person whose job it is to take care of myself, to take care of my biological needs, to take care of my physical needs. Okay, I have a few moments a week, for a day or a week for spirituality, but that's just a drop in the bucket. That's not what defines me. So what this parasha is telling you, no, it's not the case. And you don't measure who you are by how much time you're spending in this activity, right? Because we're spending 6 years in the field, and 1 year dedicated to God. And in our week, it's the same thing. In general, 6 days a week we work, on the 7th day we rest. And we have time for spirituality. But again, the question is, how do I self-define? What is serving what? Am I going to work so I could spend time with family on the weekend? Or am I spending time at home at the weekend resting so I can go back to work, right? It's a shift in perspective, but it makes all the difference. What are my values? How do I self-define what's meaningful to me? Am I working so I can rest on Shabbat, or am I resting on Shabbat so I could work? So this is by way of introduction. Now in a moment, we'll go into the economy. We'll talk about the economics a little bit, and then perhaps we'll go and talk about the next parsha, the rebuke, and the blessings and the curses, and how to find the blessings hidden within the curses. So we have a lot to talk about. So if anybody wants to make a comment or ask a question, wonderful. Otherwise, we will proceed.
Rabbi, question. In your opening remarks, you mentioned that the slaves go free. Was it Jubilee year, I think you said?
Yes.
But that was only Jewish slaves, right? Not Gentile.
Correct. Correct. When it comes to slaves going free, it gets a little more complicated. When you sell a Jewish slave, he goes free on the 7th year. If he doesn't want to go free on the 7th year, then he goes free. Then he can stay to the 50th. But on the 50th, everybody has to go free. When it comes to Gentile slaves, it becomes a little bit more complicated. Sometimes you don't have to wait for the 50th year. It's another subject altogether. And basically, what happens is, I'm just going to mute everybody. When it comes to a slave who's a Gentile slave, the law is that when they become a slave in a Jewish home, they have to convert and they have to accept some of the commandments. So in other words, they have to reject idol worship, and they have to actually do more than just the 7 Noahide laws. They have many commandments that they're obligated to do, although not all the commandments. Now, if you free a Gentile slave, the only way to free a Gentile slave is he becomes Jewish. In other words, the process of becoming a slave in a Jewish home was the beginning of conversion. It's not complete because it was almost coerced, but if you're going to free a Jewish slave, a Gentile slave, the person is going to become Jewish and full-fledged Jew. So then there's a question, when do you do it, and how do you do it, and should you do it, and should you not do it? But that's a discussion for another time. Okay. Unmute all. Okay, and now more broadly, the concept of freedom that comes with the land is also, I know this. Ultimately, who's free? Ultimately, you're free if you have land. If you don't have land, then ultimately you may have movable property, you may have money, you may have cash, you may have stocks, you may have bonds, but ultimately that can crash. Ultimately, you can use that. You can lose that. So ultimately, freedom is when you the land and you own your land. And that's another meaning of when you say there will be freedom in the land. It also implies that everybody gets their real estate back. And if you have real estate, in some sense, that's the most freeing. But that's sort of the broader meaning. Okay, it's actually a wonderful morning for me because I get to talk about whatever I want because no one's telling me what they want me to talk about. But okay, fine. You want me to do, I'll do. Fine. Okay, one thing to think about, we talk about the economic model that we're trying to build over here. So the question becomes, what model are we trying to do? One model would be sort of extreme capitalism. In other words, this private property and everybody is on their own and everybody competes to make the most profit as possible. That's one model. The other model becomes sort of more of a collectivism, where people are more socialistic, where people care for the community. And you can get that extreme. You can get extreme cases of communism where there's no private property at all, or you can go to other cases of socialism where sort of the resources of the country are shared. There's all kinds of models. And the question, of course, becomes, where does Judaism come down on this question of what's the proper economic model? And it's clear that the Torah believes in private property. The Torah also believes that the number one flaw of socialism is that it disincentivizes people to work and to be creative. So on one hand, the Torah system is capitalistic. There's private property, it's respected, and there's no concept of I have a legal responsibility to share my own wealth beyond a certain point. But on the other hand, as our dear friend, nice Jewish guy named Karl Marx wrote a book, you can buy it in the store. There's a certain problems with capitalism, and some of the problems become that things can spiral out of control, and if someone's on a downward trend, ultimately they could become even more and more poor, and they can't turn themselves around, or it becomes very difficult to turn themselves around. And what do? Either they're completely impoverished, or what has happened in history and is happening today all over the world, people migrate, they go to a different place where they could find a better future or hope for themselves and their family. So it seems like this is what the Torah is trying to do. The Torah is trying to have an anchor in the land of Israel for even the most unfortunate people who manage to lose everything because they're not successful, but there's still going to be an anchor. They're still going to have hope. They still have what to look forward to, and ultimately what to keep them connected to the land of Israel. And that's why they're not going to necessarily run and move to a new country to find a better future for their descendants, because ultimately they realize that specifically in the land of Israel, they have a sort of a safety net in the form of real estate coming back to the family. So that's a very interesting thing. I know I'm talking about economics, which is very political. So if I'm saying anything that triggers you, let me know, and I give you the floor. Next point, a very interesting point that I really, there's two more points that I want to say, and then we'll open up the floor, and then we move on. So there's another point here. Another point is that, let's say I'm poor and I'm forced to sell my house. Not my land, my ancestral land, the land that my parents, that I inherited from my forefathers in Israel. Okay. Now I was lazy. I didn't get up. I didn't plow my field. So I have no food. So if I have no food, I have no choice. I have to sell my possessions. Eventually I sell my land. Eventually I'm poor. I sell my land. Okay. What happens now? I don't even have to wait for the 50th year. What happens is I can save up enough money to buy it back. What price do I buy it back? So you basically divide the amount of years left to the Jubilee by the price of how much I paid. So let's say there's 40 years left to the Jubilee and I paid $40,000. So it's $1,000 per year. So at any point, I could buy it back at the prorated amount. So if 20 years pass, I give you $20,000 and I buy back my land. That's the system in biblical Israel. It applies when the Jubilee applies. Fine. What is so interesting about this model? So you could say, well, the Torah wants me to have my ancestral land. That's true too. But there's another feature that comes out of this, and the feature is as follows: if I'm desperate to sell, I have no food, so I'm going to put my ancestral land up for real estate. Oh, by the way, one more detail: not only I could buy back my land for the price that I bought, that I sold it prorated, but any of my relatives can buy it back and to give it back to me. Another detail, so keep that in mind. Now, so let's say I forgot to, I slept in, I was hungover for a month and I did not plow and I did not plant, and that's why this year I'm hungry, I have no food. So I have to sell my land. But I'm desperate. So what happens if you're desperate to sell your land? Of course, the price goes down, right? The more desperate you are, the less money you're going to get for the land. So what happens over here is, it's very interesting. if I'm desperate to sell my land, you want to buy. So typically you would have an incentive to pay as little as possible. But once you introduce this law that I can buy back the land, or my neighbor or my relatives can buy back the land for me, what happens now? Now everything flips, the incentives flip. Now your incentive is to pay as much as possible for this land. You want to overpay. Why do you want to overpay? To disincentivize me or my relatives from buying it back and waiting for the Jubilee year. So you see what's happening? What's happening is we're getting another layer of protection for the poor, and that is that they're not going to sell. They're not going to be forced to sell for too low because the buyer has an incentive to overpay, or at least play market value, certainly not underpay. Because if I underpay, then my second cousin is going to come back and buy it right out of you because he's upset that you got the good deal. So that's one dimension. I'm going to say one more economic angle here, and then we open up the floor, and then we move on to other things. There's a fascinating law, and I told you, I just mentioned it now, that if I sell my land on the 50th year, if I sell my land up to the 50th year, or at any point, the relative could buy it back, and it will go back to, and relative can buy it back, or at the Jubilee year, all the land goes back. But there's one exception to the rule. Very interesting exception. What's the exception? If you have a walled city, if I sell a home in a walled city, I have up to 1 year to buy it back. After 1 year, it doesn't go back to the owner. It doesn't go back to the original owner. I can't buy it back, and the Jubilee does not affect homes within a walled city. Why not? What happened at a walled city? If we believe that lowland should go back, why is the walled city different? That's an interesting question, but that's the law. So one way to think about this is as follows. What's the problem if you have a city? What's city life? Farm life, okay. Rural life, the land is supposed to give you sustenance. That's the purpose of the land. And that's why we say you have to sell, no problem. You get it back, it's all good. Fine. No sale of land, only lease. It's wonderful. Okay. What's the city life? City life is much more complicated. City life is where people get together and they pool their resources together, pool their talents together, and now they could start being creative. They can develop art. They could develop medicine. They could develop culture. They can create schools. They can create universities. They can create what we call civilization. Okay. What happens? Remember, this is before the Zoom age. Today, all the universities shut down, and you have Zoom, and everybody's happy. The schools are happy because they charge the same amount. God forbid they're not going to give a discount on tuition, but their expenses go down. It's a win-win. Everybody's happy, except for the parents, because they have to pay the tuition plus have the kids at home. Could you imagine? I understand to pay the money to get the kids out the door, but to pay the money and have the kids at home, that I still can't get my head around that. But in any case, that's the model today. But if you had, so there's no Zoom, okay? So what happens? So we have schools in this country that are a few hundred years old. In Europe, there are schools that are 800 years old, 900 years old. What happens if every 50 years, all the land in the city goes back to its owner? So now the university fell apart because all the tenured professors have to move out of their house because it all goes back, it resets. So if everything is resetting every 50 years, then you can't advance society, you can't advance culture, you can't advance the arts, you can't advance humanities, you can't advance anything. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to carve out certain spaces. And the Talmud is clear that you can't make a trick. You can't just decide to wall off the whole metropolitan area of New York. It has to be a place that was first walled and then settled, as opposed to first settled and then walled. So what happens is we want to carve out places where there will be continuity, where people can get together and build on the previous generations and create an institution that's a few hundred years old. On the other hand, we like the idea that the land reverts back to its original ownership to allow to give people a sense of financial security. So we have we have to balance these two ideas. On one hand, we want land going back. On the other hand, we want people to be able to create continuation and build upon the achievements of the past. So the way we do that is we have two systems. If you're selling land in land, or even a home in a field in a city that's not walled, then there's no sale. It only goes up to 49 years. The 50th year it goes back home. It goes back to its original owner. But if there's a specific area, a walled city, there the laws of Jubilee don't apply. Why do the laws of Jubilee not apply? Because we understand the importance of building upon the previous generation's achievements. And if you have to reset the institution every 50 years, you're not going to be able to create any progress. So that's the few words on the economic model of the Torah as described in the portion of Behar. Of course, most of this does not apply nowadays because there's no Jubilee, and the Jubilee. Why doesn't the Jubilee apply? Because the Jubilee applies when most of the Jews are living in Israel and when they're divided by the tribes. Now we have at least 10 tribes that are lost. So the system of the land going back to its tribe, to the ancestral land, the way it was divided based on the tribes, that cannot apply today. So the Jubilee doesn't apply. The sabbatical, there's a disagreement if it's rabbinic or biblical. The bottom line is today there are many people in Israel that do keep the sabbatical. They don't let the land. They don't work the land. Then there are other people who have loopholes, but that's another discussion. We can discuss that. But before that, I feel like I should start opening up the floor here. Unmute if anybody wants to share. And when I came to Greenwich, I'll make a confession here. Unmute all. I'll make a confession. When I came to Greenwich, I understood that there are some topics that you have to be careful because they're hot button issues, cultural issues. If you have I don't know, euthanasia, abortion. You have topics that people get very passionate about. You got to be careful. You got to tread carefully. But one thing I didn't realize, and that was like sort of a big awakening. I realized that the most controversial issue, at least in this town, but maybe I don't know. The most controversial issue is the rabbi starts talking about economic policy. Oh my God, that's the real hot button issue. Everything else is not as important, but economic policies are people get very passionate about, which is wonderful. So I hope that I said something that at least will get some people upset. It's controversy here on some discussion. Okay, here you go. Okay, if nobody has any questions, that means everything is fine. That means I continue, but that's a threat, by the way. Okay. Okay, so I think that's a lot of the first parasha. There's more to talk about. Okay, I'll just say 10 seconds about not 10 seconds, a minute or two about the counting of the Jubilee. There is a certain parallel. The Kli Yakar points out. Kli Yakar is one of my favorite commentators. He was a rabbi in Prague in the 16th century. He was the successor of the Maharal of Prague. So he's got commentary. He's also got some Kabbalah. He's also Pam's great-grandfather. So we have a personal connection, but he's a great guy. In any case, he points out the connection between the system of the 49 years, the counting, and then you get the 50th year, which is the Jubilee, and the 50th year you proclaim freedom. And of course, a lot of this doesn't apply today in the economic sense, but it does apply in the spiritual sense. And one way that it applies in the spiritual sense is if you think about, we too follow this model this time of the year. We're counting 49 days, not 49 years, but 49 days until between Passover and Shavuot and the holiday when we celebrate the giving of the Torah. And then on the 50th day, which is the day we get the Torah, what happens? We proclaim freedom. What does freedom mean? So freedom means spiritual freedom. It could be economic freedom, but it could also be freedom of bondage. It could be freedom of economic freedom, but it can also be spiritual freedom. So what the Kli Yakar is pointing out is that if we understand that the 49 days that we count is spiritual refinement. Talked about this many times. There's 7 character traits. Each character trait includes all 7. So you have 49 sub emotions. There's 49 shades of emotions. And the period between Passover and Shavuot is we try to refine our emotions. We try to refine align them with God or with their spiritual source. And then when we get to the 50th year, when we get to Shavuot, if we follow the model, then we are proclaiming freedom in the land, because we have in some sense reached the concept of spiritual freedom to some degree. We are more refined. We're not controlled by our emotion, but to the contrary, our emotion is directed by our intelligence. And in that sense, that's true freedom. Somebody who's totally trapped by their instinct and then by their emotion, they're enslaved to self. But somebody who has refined their emotion, and the way we define refining the emotion is applying enlightenment or wisdom to the emotion, then they reach a state of freedom. And we mentioned this many times before, but I'll mention it again. The metaphor would be where you have the mind as the steering wheel, and you would have the heart as the emotion as the engine. And if you just follow the engine and your steering wheel is not working, so it's a wonderful engine. It can get from 0 to 70 in 0.3 of a second, but it can also crash you into the wall because you're just following raw emotion. And the process of counting the 49 days is a process of having a little bit of steering wheel. With the steering wheel, the mind directs the heart where to apply the emotion. So that's, again, if we had time, we'd go into this about where does the Jubilee apply in our life today? Where do we attain spiritual freedom? It happens in the process of lead up to Shavuot, where we count the 49 days. It looks like somebody wants to ask a question. I like questions, so I'm going to open up.
It's me, Rabbi. It's Bob.
Go ahead.
Just a brief question about, okay, so you've said we start with the rest year, and then you work. So forget that there's a paradoxical difference between 6 of work and 1 of rest, but it seems all the laws and the values and the minutia have to do with the work and not the rest. I mean, the rest is left kind of, yes, you free this, you free that, but there's nothing really spiritual about it. It seems that Behar is more preoccupied with the mundane than it is the spiritual. And if your point is we start with the spiritual because that's the self-defining aspect of it, it seems that they take a lot of real estate for the mundane.
Yes. Okay. Excellent points. Excellent points. Just to clarify what I said earlier, when I said we start with the rest, I don't mean that we actually start with resting. I mean that's the goal. But yes, I think we're on the same page. So the answer must be. So I just want to point out how do I know this is a spiritual exercise, not just a time to rest and relax, so you have more power, more strength to go back to work. So if you look at the verses, for example, verse 2, the land shall rest a Shabbat to God. It's connecting it to God. The sabbatical. The sabbatical says you should pass a shofar, teruah, on the 7th month, on the 10th of the month, on Yom Kippur. In other words, when does the Jubilee take effect? The Jubilee takes effect on Yom Kippur. That tells us that this is a spiritual process. It's almost like it's a year of Yom Kippur. And then if you need it more clear, the next verse, the Kidashtem, you shall sanctify the 50th year, make it holy. So it's clear that we're talking about not just physical rest, we're talking about a rest that will give us time to reconnect to our soul and reconnect to God. Having said that, your point is clear. Your point is that you're telling us how to work, but you're not telling us how to rest. And in fact, resting is a very, very big problem. Most people don't have a hard time resting. They could be lying on the beach and there's checking their text messages. There's no text messages, but maybe there's going to be a text message. So who knows? There's a suffix, there's a doubt that maybe a text message will come up, so you keep looking. It's a very complicated thing to do, at least in the West, to stop and just relax. It's a hard thing for people to do. It's an important thing, but it's a hard thing. So I would say, if I have to address this, I would say is that the reason why you have more regulation about work is because work is much more complicated. Why is work more complicated? Because it's a paradox. I have to, on one hand, be invested in success. On one hand, I have to be invested in being ambitious in the physical sense of being successful and almost desiring the wealth, right? Nobody ever became rich if they didn't want to. And if they didn't really want to it, and they didn't have that deep, strong desire, unless you happen by mistake. But for most people, it takes a tremendous amount of will and willpower and investment of time and energy, and almost like it's all encompassing to actually be successful in the real world. So to do that and yet be anchored in the values of the Torah, that's complicated. And because it's complicated, there's regulation. And because there's regulation, that's why the Torah spends so much time talking about it. In other words, it's easier to be just physical or just spiritual. It's hard to do both. And that's why Shabbat or the sabbatical year is relatively easy. What do? You turn off your materialistic ambitions. You say, look, whatever I achieved in the last 6 years is wonderful, but now I can't think about it anyway because I can't work in the field anyway. So now, okay, I have time to go and study Torah. Wonderful thing. But to be able to be simultaneously in both worlds, to be ambitious and want to succeed and be invested in the success, and yet be anchored in the morality and the values of the Torah, and remember that essentially I'm a Sinai Jew. Essentially, I'm not here. Essentially, what is my essence? My essence is I'm a Jew from Sinai, and yet to be able to be invested in the economy to that degree, that's a balancing act, and that's much more difficult. And because it's much more difficult, it takes up more real estate, pun intended. As you said, it takes up more real estate. So I hope that's somewhat helpful. Okay, so we discussed this. We discussed the 49 years, the sabbatical, the way it appears within a person's life, which is the counting of the Omer, and the 50th year, which is Shavuot. Okay, let's read a little bit. We're going to go to the next parsha. The next parsha talks about the blessings and the rebuke. I'm reading the second portion, begins in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 3. If you follow my statutes and you keep the mitzvot and you do it, what's going to happen if you keep the Torah? So the Torah says if you keep the Torah, you're going to go to heaven. No, I'm kidding. It doesn't say that. If you keep the Torah, the rain will come on time, the earth will give its produce, and the trees will give their yield, and unbelievable. You'll have a lot of grain basically, and there'll be peace in the land, and there'll be no sword passing through your land. Jay Marmor used to live here. Jay used to work in the UN, and the joke was that the verse says. A sword won't pass through your land, meaning an army won't pass through your land. Rashi says, what does that mean? It already says there'll be peace. If there'll be peace, what does it mean a sword? What does it mean an army won't pass your land? So Rashi says, afilu cherev shel shalom, even a sword of peace. You need to say an army passing your land, even if they're not here for war, that is passing your land, that itself is traumatic. So no army will pass your land, not even an army of peace. So the joke used to be when we were kids that a cherev shel shalom, a sword of peace, is the UN forces. You go to the north of Israel, you have the UN forces. Their job is to make peace, but really what their job is to bother the Israeli side and let the Hezbollah do whatever they want. So the blessing would be that they'll be so peaceful, you won't even need the UN there, and you won't have a cherev shel shalom, you won't have a sword of peace. That's the joke. Jay's not here, but I guess we have to mention him anyway. In any case, and then you have a whole list of rebuke, curses, bad things that will happen. Eventually, God says, even after the exile, God's covenant will not be nullified, and that's a very important point because many people, many people what am I saying? Many people told the Jewish people that we have to convert because the exile is proof that God annulled this covenant with us. So here we have it black on white. It's not the case. Okay, fine. There's a lot to talk about. The first thing let's talk about is the concept that God's promise for keeping the Torah is not heaven. Why not? It doesn't say anything in the Torah about going to heaven. And the answer is because the Torah is true. If the Torah is true, let's say I'm fabricating this document, right? Let's say I'm fabricating the document and I want to get people to study the Torah. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, if you keep the Torah, you'll go to heaven. Why is that such a good model? Because nobody can disprove me. You can't disprove me because nobody came back from heaven. The Torah doesn't do that. The Torah says if you follow the Torah, the rain will come. In other words, you can test it. Now, of course, it doesn't mean necessarily that if I, as an individual, follow the Torah, the test will come, the rain will come. It means that when the Jewish people were living in Israel collectively, and the collective Jewish community in Israel were following the Torah, they were blessed. And that's the record. And when we strayed and we followed the idols, then the exile happens. And that's also historical. Now, once we're in exile, things change. The idea is the whole purpose of exile is that God's providence is not revealed. But these verses have to be understood that collectively, when we're in Israel, if we're following the word of God, the rain will come and the earth will be fertile, etc., etc. And that's a very interesting point. The promise the Torah makes is not a promise of heaven because that cannot be tested. The promise the Torah makes is a promise that could be tested. I failed to mention earlier that in the only place in the Torah, last week's the first parsha is the only place in the Torah where the Torah asks a question of faith. The Torah says, "What are you?" You may ask, "What are you going to do in the What are you going to eat in the seventh year? What are we going to eat?" Very strange. The Torah doesn't say, "Well, if I can't work on Shabbat, what am I going to eat?" Right? But this is the only case where the Torah says, "If you're going to ask, what am I going to eat in the seventh year if I'm not working the land?" And the Torah promises, the verse says, "I will command my blessing, and on this sixth year, the earth will give enough produce for 3 years, for year 6, for year 7, and the beginning of year 8." And again, this is another example where the Torah makes a pledge that could be tested, and that's a fascinating thing to contemplate. Okay, so those are the blessings. Now you want to look at the curses. What are the curses? The curses are rebuke, and the curses are terrible. And I always used to say that it's bad, but it's not as bad as Jewish history. Unfortunately, this and more has befallen our people, and yet we're still here to tell the tale. So that's a little bit about the curses. Hasidim, they can't deal with the curses. In other words, the way that Hasidim read the portion of the curses is they explain that the curses could be understood literally, but they don't have to be understood literally. They could be understood as blessings in disguise. In other words, when God said these verses, these verses are going to come true. The question is, are they going to come true in the physical sense and the way they appear, which would be negative, or is there a hidden blessing within them? And the Hasidim would insist that there's great blessings within the curses. They're just so powerful that they have to be hidden. And there's sources in the Talmud like that. I don't want to go into it, but Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who celebrated his passing on Lag BaOmer, his son Eliezer was going to get married, so his son goes to visit his father's friends, and they all give him terrible curses. Your house should be destroyed, and they give him all terrible curses. He came home, and his father explained to him how they're really blessings in disguise. So this Hasidic exercise of reinterpreting these verses to be positive actually has a Talmudic source as well. Okay, so what should we do? I think we should focus on at least one verse and see how terrible it sounds, and then see how the Hasidim reinterpret this verse to explain that it's up to us how we interpret it and how we define it, and it's up to us to explain how this can actually be a positive and a blessing in disguise with just a little creative interpretation. So here we go. The verse describes verse describes, amongst other things, a terrible famine. And
which verse is this?
I'll get to the verse in a moment. I have to find it, of course. Oh, one more point I want to say is the reason. One of the points here one of the points here is clear that the Torah makes the point that the primary reason for, at least the way it's described in this portion, is the fact that the Jewish people did not keep the sabbatical year. It's a very difficult thing to do, and eventually people stopped doing it. And the Torah basically talks about the fact that the reason why the first exile was 70 years is because of the 70 sabbatical years that the Jewish people did not keep properly. So maybe that's the connection between both portions. In other words, the only way we can be in the land of Israel is if we appreciate and respect the holiness of Israel. But if we're in Israel and we're not respecting the holiness of Israel, then ultimately we can't survive there. But in any case, so we have this, I'm looking for the verse here, we have a terrible famine. So if you look at chapter 26 and you look at verse 26, wow, chapter 26, verse 26, terrible verse. Here it goes. When I'll break for you the staff of bread, right? So staff of bread is a metaphor of a staff because it holds you back up, it's sustenance. So there'll be no staff of bread. That's a phrase in Hebrew. In other words, even in modern Hebrew, you want to say sustenance you. What do what sustains you, what's your occupation? You would call it mate lechem, your staff of bread. So God will break the staff of bread. You'll have 10 women who are baking their bread in one oven, because there's not going to be enough. There's not going to be that much bread, and they have to save on firewood. Firewood is important, is very, very valuable because of the poverty. Then he says they're going to measure it to divide it, and then maybe the most devastating part of the verse is you will eat and you will not be satiated. And terrible. So we don't have a lot of food. We have to divide it. We have to be very careful about the firewood. Finally, we eat it and we're not satisfied. And this is a terrible verse. There's a beautiful, beautiful discourse of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad, who explains how this verse, again, it played out in the negative, but it could play out in the positive, and everything is reinterpreted to be positive. So this is just a sample. The reason why I'm trying to say this concept is because this is a sample. In some ways, what the Hasidic masters are telling us, that almost everything in life is basically neutral. In other words, not neutral. Whether it's a blessing or it's a curse is really up to our perspective. So, for example, pain. Is pain a blessing or a curse? Well, it depends. It depends what's happening. It depends on the context. If I am decided to train to run the marathon, it's very painful, right? It's painful, but it's not a curse, right? It's growth, and growth requires pain. But pain does not equate necessarily suffering. Pain, it depends on the context. So this exercise helps us think about life in general and think about what's the external perspective and what's the deeper perspective. Okay, so we're going to engage in this exercise, read this verse because it's so beautiful, and then we're going to open up the floor. So, lechem, let's do the easy one. So we have this phrase, we have this puzzle. We have to figure out what's the hidden message. Okay, so imagine we have this activity. We have to decode this verse. So we have, again, God will break the staff of bread. There'll be 10 women who are baking their bread in one oven. They're going to eat and not be satisfied. So let's try to uncover the hidden meaning in this verse. So what are the easy ones to solve? So we'll start with lechem, bread. Lechem is easy. Lechem is bread. What's bread? Bread is spiritual sustenance, Torah. Okay, so we know that the Talmud says that the Torah is likened to bread because it's just like the food, just like the body needs food, the soul needs food as well. The soul needs spiritual nourishment, and the spiritual nourishment that the soul needs is bread. Okay, let's think about bread for a second. So bread, you have dough, but you cannot eat the dough. You have to put it in an oven, right? You could just say, the point is, why is this getting so poetic? Just say you won't have enough bread. No, we talk about bread, we talk about 10 women, we talk about an oven. It's very graphic. So from the perspective of the Kabbalah, there has to be more meaning here, because otherwise, why are you saying, why are you being so verbose? Why are you talking in such detail? Just say you'll have no bread. No, you'll have bread. There's going to be an oven. They're going to be putting 10 pieces of bread in one oven. What's going on here? So again, the bread is the Torah. Bread is the dough, is the Torah. The problem with bread is that if you eat the dough, it's not going to be digested. Meaning to say, you could study Torah, you could sit all day and study Torah from morning to night, but the knowledge is not going to be internalized. right? Just because I study about something, it doesn't mean it's internalized. It's a famous story of the Baal Shem Tov. Not a famous story. I was going to say something else. But if the joke is that the person comes into the synagogue, to the study hall, and says, "Could you please help me? What do you need? I need help. My donkey collapsed under the burden, under its weight, and I need you to help me reload my donkey." They said, "We can't. We're too busy studying." It's interesting. What are you studying? Is we're studying the laws of how you have to stop and help somebody and reload their donkey, right? So studying doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be internalized. So mystically speaking, you have your dough, you have your bread, but your bread is not going to be internalized. So how do you internalize the bread? So the same way you internalize dough, the only way the dough would be able to be digestible or digested is if you bake it. You need fire. So the ingredient that allows for the dough to be digested is the fire. What is in the analogy? What is the concept of fire? So fire is passion. Fire is love to God. In other words, you can have the Torah, you can have an idea, you can have an intellectual idea, but the intellectual idea is not going to change you. The only way the intellectual idea is going to change you is if it's coming and being placed within the fire of your emotional connection to God. If you really want to connect to God, then the knowledge will affect you. Okay, so we have bread and we have oven. What's 10 women? So woman is the Jewish people, fine. What's 10? So 10 would represent the 10 attributes of the soul. In other words, the fire has to permeate the passion, has to permeate all aspects of the person. And then you have your 10 women with one oven. What is one? One is easy, right? One is God, right? So one oven, which means oven is fire. Fire for what? Fire for the one. Fire for the oneness of Hashem. So in other words, we're saying, what do I do? What happens? What's going to happen is you're going to have your bread, and all the 10 aspects of the soul are going to be permeated with the oneness, with the love to God, and then the bread will be internalized. Okay? What's the end of the verse? You will eat and not be satisfied. Okay, it sounds like a terrible curse. Sounds like the worst, the culmination of how terrible the verse is, the curse is. But in truth, if it appears to be the worst, it must be the best. What's the biggest blessing? The biggest blessing is that if you have this great love to God, your thirst and your passion and your longing will never be satisfied. Every time you do a mitzvah, you're going to want to do. It's going to intensify your passion and not decrease it, right? Because we have a crisis. We have a crisis, and that is that typically what happens is we're always looking for something new, for something exciting, and the more you have it, the less you appreciate it. And therefore, it's a challenge. You know, the Torah says, we say it in the Shema, in the second verse of the Shema, God says, "These words that I command you today." So Rashi says, quotes the Medrash, every time you study Torah, you have to study it as if you got it today for the first time, not as some old document for 3,000 years, because people naturally get excited about something new. So it's a difficult thing to be able to have a relationship over time. And every day, not that the relationship diminishes or the love diminishes, but to the contrary, that the love deepens. And that's the highlight of the verse. Even though you're internalizing the Torah, it's not going to satisfy you. It's actually going to increase your passion and your desire to connect to God. And this is where, again, I'll stop here, but this is where this physical and the spiritual diverge. When it comes to the physical reality, if you eat a piece of chocolate, if you have a bar of chocolate like me and you want to eat the whole bar, no, you don't want to, but you end up eating the whole bar. Why do you eat the whole bar of chocolate? It's very simple. The first piece of chocolate is very tasty. The second, then you want more of it, so you take the second piece of chocolate. The problem is that the second piece of chocolate is never as tasty as the first. So what you do is you say, maybe the third bite will go back to bite number one. Then you eat the third bite. You know what happens in the third bite? It's even less than the second. So you eat more and more. You're constantly looking to recreate that first moment of pleasure, because it's always in the first bite. Because after that, once you had something, automatically your desire cannot be as much as you had it to begin with. That's the fact of physical life. When it comes to spiritual life, it's the opposite. Spiritual life, I'm not even talking about mystical, but things in this world that are a little bit more spiritual. Once you acquire wisdom, that could actually make you want more wisdom. Unlike the piece of chocolate where the pleasure, in other words, I increase my pleasure, the more I have, the more I want. In other words, the more I enjoy it. the more the passion exists. And that's, in some sense, the greatest blessing. That if we're sitting here and we study Torah and we say that I study Torah today, and what does that do for my love to God? That means that tomorrow I want to study even more. That's the greatest blessing of them all. That we don't lose the passion. To the contrary, the passion is increased. So we covered a lot of ground. We started with economics. We moved to spirituality. We moved to reinterpreting the blessings into the curses into blessings. We moved to try to figure out how to increase the passion. So there's a whole spectrum of concepts here. I hope everybody took something everybody has something that they found interesting. I have nowhere to go because there's Corona. So if anybody wants to share or ask or debate or disagree, now is the time. Unmute all. Go ahead. Otherwise, everybody should have a wonderful day. It's going to be a nice day today. Enjoy it. Next week, it's going to be raining all day, all week. So maybe I won't have to water the bushes. But in any case, this week, enjoy the day, enjoy the weekend, enjoy Shabbos, and make it a Shabbos to Hashem.
Rabbi, do you have interpretations for all the negative penalties that God says, and you turn into a
I don't have all. The thing is that if they wrote all, then what would me and you do, right? So in other words, they left some of it for our creativity. There are some that are explained. Rashi even explains some. You know, Rashi, even who's not even a mystic, explains some of them, and some of them we have to do. For example, I'll give you the one Rashi explains. Rashi explains. He says that once we will be I'm trying to figure out if he says it here or he says it in yeah, he says it here. If you look at 26:33, chapter 26:33, it talks about that once that the lands of your cities will be desolate, and your temple will be desolate, and the land will be empty. Sounds like a terrible curse, right? All the cities of Israel will be destroyed, and the land will be empty. Says Rashi, it's actually a great blessing. What's the blessing? The blessing is, and this is a historic fact, it's unbelievable. The blessing is that no other occupying force has ever been able to settle the land of Israel. Israel has been desolate from the destruction of the temple until the 19th century when the Jews came back. So there were some settlements in Caesarea, in the cities, but as a whole, the land itself was desolate. Nobody grew anything in the land of Israel for 1,800 years until the Jews came back. So it looks like a verse that's so terrible, but it could also be explained in the positive. So that's not mystical, but it's positive. But our job is to explain how everything is positive in the mystical sense as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. And we should meet up in good health and only good things.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Amen.